Good afternoon. My name is Georgianne Moss, and I'm the Senior Director of Sustainability for Dallas College. Welcome to this session, which is called Beyond Debate, How We Can Move Beyond Our Seemingly Intractable War of Ideas. But before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes for you. Today's session is being recorded, and so it will be available for viewing after the conference. Give us about a week, though, so that we can get those links added back to the website that you've been using for navigation today. You'll go back to the same website to see the recordings. Also, we have enabled closed captioning for today's event. And so if you would like to see closed captions on your screen, just go to the bottom of your screen in the left-hand corner, and you can click on the CC button there. If you have any questions for our presenter today, please use the Q&A function. And if you just want to make comments during the presentation, use the chat feature. And the reason is, with questions, we can capture them and make sure that we answer them, whereas chat, if lots of people are chatting at the same time, we lose track of the questions, and we don't want to do that. We want to make sure we answer your questions. If you have any technical issues, please go back to the original website, and there's 3 different ways. There's a phone number, and there's an email, and there's a live meeting room that you can enter to get help with those. And our speaker today is going to have a total of 55 minutes altogether, and about 35 of it is going to be your presentation, and we'll have enough time for about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Lara Schwartz. Lara teaches at the American University School of Public Affairs, where she is the founding director of the Project on Civil Discourse. Before joining the School of Public Affairs faculty, Lara worked as a civil rights advocate in national organizations, including the Human Rights Campaign and the American Association of People with Disabilities. She's also served as a law clerk for Judge Ronald Lee Gilman on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. She offers workshops on dialogues across difference, productive discourse, dispute resolution, student activism, free speech, and academic freedom. She is the co-author of How to College, What to Know Before You Go and When You're There. And from June 2019 through June 2020, she was a fellow at the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. She is proud to have won American University School of Public Affairs Faculty Awards for teaching, for service to the university, and for service to the community. And so now it's with great pleasure I turn it over to Lara Schwartz.
Thank you, Georgianne, and thank you to everyone who's joined today and who's participating in this conference. I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm really grateful for the technology that enables me to join you for this conference, even though I'm in DC. I feel like the capacity to be with one another across distance is, often portrayed, and we'll get into that in a little bit, as one of the negatives, both whether in our pandemic situation where there have been a lot of formerly in-person experiences that have changed to online, or just generally there's a rap that digital communication gets, that's very deficit oriented, that a lot of why we find ourselves debating instead of discussing lately is attributable to these online spaces. But my hope is that today will be some time that we spend together that shows us the greatness of this medium. As Georgianne said, there is closed captioning available, and I think accessibility is one of the wonderful features of this medium when people attend to it, as this conference has done wonderfully so far. So Before I get started into my talk about the thing that one of the things I'm very passionate about, which is engaged and productive dialogue in the public interest, I would love to utilize the chat, another of the great features of our online engagement. I'd love to use the chat to get a sense. I think I'm probably coming in to people's lives a bit after lunch, in the midst of this great conference, maybe after a break. So I'm wondering if you can use the chat and let me know what color you would describe your mood is coming into this talk. Just ate lunch outside, so green, a lot of green, which is quite fitting for a sustainability conference. So one of the things about that question is that clear blue. That makes me happy. One of the things about that question is it gives us a little chance to know where we are as we come into this talk. But of course, this question of what color your mood is also, it doesn't let us know everything about one another. For example, clear blue to me sounds very happy. Blue is my favorite color, and the idea of clarity is always welcome when we're talking about tough conversations or anything else. But right, blue at times can actually mean, like the blues, negative. Green can mean envy, or it can mean, fresh rebirth. So we obviously need more information from each other than just this. And I think that I like to start often with this little exercise, because it reminds us both to take a moment and listen to each other, but then as well to understand that, each little bit of information that we get from one another really should just open us to more questions and follow-up questions and additional opportunities and imperatives to listen. So thinking about coming here, as the description of this talk said, I am often asked to come to various places, whether by Zoom or once upon a time in person, and give some advice about how to engage in more civil debate. And I generally say no. And I say no for reasons that I'll make clear in a bit, because I really don't think debate is necessarily the right goal in almost any context. There are some contexts where debates work, but I particularly think that in higher education or any educational contexts, I am a college professor. I often speak to colleges, universities, K-12 schools, and other educational institutions. The idea of a debate seems ill-fitting because we don't go to school to fight. We go to school to inquire, to learn, to seek truth, to expand the bounds of human knowledge or become more familiar with human knowledge. So the idea of merely fighting but doing it politely doesn't seem quite right. The idea of what I think civil discourse is and what I think productive civic engagement is, which is important to your mission here of sustainability, and really important college discourse is the idea of doing something productively that serves our shared community interests. If you look behind me, my office is not very glamorous. What I have on the wall behind me is two of the big Post-it note posters with smaller Post-its on them. And one of them says at the top of it, what do I want for myself? And the other is, what will I ask of myself? I asked all my students these two questions at the beginning of every semester and give them 2 Post-it notes each. And then I hang on to this and we revisit it. So things that students might want for themselves are to become more knowledgeable, to get a good grade, to have a successful first semester back in person. And the things that they often ask of themselves are patience, open-mindedness to opposing views, resilience, commitment to doing the reading, commitment to sharing their ideas or hearing other people's ideas. And these 2 questions, what do I want for myself, which could be anything from a good grade to a healthier planet? And what will I ask of myself from doing the reading to making good decisions about how to use your voice in a civic context, whether it is in activism on behalf of sustainability initiatives, student activism, speech in class, or just your studies or your teaching, is the question that could very well answer what you'll have for yourself, what you will have for yourself. I have on the slide my thoughts on a piece of wisdom that seems to really capture what I'm hopeful we can think about when we think about what is productive to do in our current moment, where there are enormous amounts of intractable polarization, where conversations in classes and on campuses and in legislatures and nationally and certainly online seem hard. So my grandfather, who passed in 2002, but who I was lucky to know for, decades of my life, every time I would see him, or particularly around his birthday, we would say, Papa, what is it like to be 90? What is it like to be 91? What is it like to be 92? And he would just laugh and he'd say, it's better than the alternative. And as I approach my 50th birthday, I'm starting to understand where that came from. There's a lot of goalpost moving involved in aging, a lot of compromises to make. But the idea of whatever day you have on this earth being better than the alternative, whatever you've got going on, the life that you're living is better than the alternative, I actually think is not a bad philosophy for our system of democracy and our system of often rough and tumble, messy, sometimes challenging system of speech freedom and civic dialogue, where it's not always pretty, but I think hopefully if we're doing it right, it's better than the alternative of either keeping our goals for our society and for ourselves, silent, or silencing others or ceasing to try to engage. So here's an example of another practitioner of civic dialogue who is much more famous than my late grandfather. I think people recognize this person. Yes, maybe put in the chat if you know who that is. Maybe you don't. So someone said, yes, that's Greta Thunberg. She is a youth activist who has been spending the last few years on strike from her school in order to raise awareness of and get people to take action on climate change. And when I think about civic engagement, I think about someone's idea that whatever they can do as a person would be better than the alternative, right? Better than silence. And that each person's civic engagement is going to involve figuring out what context they have, what venues they have available, and making decisions to use their voice in pursuit of maybe one-upping something better than the alternative of the status quo. I'd like to think that regardless of one's thoughts on how effective or right Ms. Thunberg is, we can agree that each of us is going to have to make decisions about how we use our voices, how we use our civic voice to make change. And it could be in the form of behavior like striking, online activity, speaking to legislatures, or it can be things as simple as the way that we engage in school and on campus. So here's a big question for everyone. And I'd love if people could share in the chat. I know the part of the reason that I'm so fortunate to be here at this conference is that many people perceive, and I think accurately, that it's very hard for us to speak to one another across our differences at this time. particularly when it comes to matters that we label as political, things that our government bodies might very well address. Why is this so hard? Why is this time so hard? Why is this action of speaking to one another in service of our policy, environmental, political priorities so hard, do we think? Because those who think they know everything are so annoying to us who do. Well put. It can be emotional. It seems like from Rachel, these are 2 points. It can be emotional. And I would argue that sometimes speech that's emotional can still be productive. And then some opinions can be harmful to groups of people. And I'm going to infer maybe opinions, for example, that involve misinformation could be harmful. We don't engage in active listening, in part listening just to listen, says Alex. And I would say, in my field, we talk about listening to understand. And yes, and John has added, unwillingness to listen and attempt to understand others. Listening to understand rather than to rebut, I would argue, is one of the skills of civic dialogue, and it's one of the skills of college level speech that we really need to learn. And there are reasons that they are not necessarily taught or developed in places outside, particularly either K-12 education or our political culture. And I'm seeing really, really wonderful stuff in the chat. Frankly, there's been deliberative. Sometimes it feels like people only want to hear opinions they already hold instead of being willing to engage. Discovering the win-win. So here are some big ideas for today that I want to lay out for you in anticipation of offering you my framework for civic dialogue, understanding what's hard about it. So first, civic dialogue is an essential skill that can be learned, but that we aren't always prepared for. So first of all, the rules and norms of K-12 education, from which our students and we, even teachers, these are different rules. So in K-12 education, the Supreme Court has said that administrators can stifle speech and expression if they believe that it could be substantially disruptive to education. And they're given enormous amounts of latitude to define what might be substantially disruptive. So my students love it when I teach a case called Morse v. Frederick, because it's about a guy who carried a sign that said "Bong hits for Jesus," and he was suspended, and they love the "Bong hits for Jesus" case. He was suspended, and the court said, sure, the school can punish this person for engaging in sort of pro-drug speech. Out in the public square, out in the world, you can say all kinds of things, as long as you're not being threatening, for example, or harassing someone. But school speech is very much constrained, and including political expressions. So your political pin, your political t-shirt supporting one candidate or another might be barred. Your expression might be barred. So to the extent that our school systems are supposed to be our practice grounds for civic engagement and the places that we learn about the kind of citizenship that we want to engage in, we're in fact taught in K-12 that some speech can be banned and even punished, and that students should go to authority figures if there's speech with which they disagree and get it handled. We're now also getting an example from around the country of parent groups believing that there's sort of a consumer idea of what kind of speech you would want in your child's classroom, and potentially putting open exchange sort of on notice that there will be political backlash. One mistake that I think many of my allies and colleagues who work on campus speech freedom make is to think that there is a training ground for college style speech and civic engagement style speech that is simply the unregulated type of speech that we have in political spaces or online spaces. And I think that's actually wrong, because political and campaign speech is usually about a simple binary about winning and losing. At the ballot box, you often have two choices, red or blue. Sometimes you might have, 14 candidates, as I think was the case with a recent mayor's race. But, generally you have a red or blue choice, a binary. Even in a ballot initiative for a state law or constitutional amendment, you get yes and no. And the communication around these things is therefore going to be, oftentimes it's just A is better than B, or as we've seen, B is very bad and disqualified. That's not the wrong way to do campaigns where people have two choices, but it's actually not what we do in classrooms, and particularly college classrooms, when we're exploring all manner of policy alternatives, of intellectual alternatives beyond yes and no. And when we're engaged in civic dialogue, whether it's asking the world powers to reduce carbon emissions, or asking our state to invest in different types of energy or utilize resources more widely, we're usually not in a conversation where there's a preset yes, no, nothing else, and our job is to make one win out and the other lose. We're trying to learn from one another. And so if we're looking at students or looking at student activism or personal activism and saying, oh, just follow politics, and bring it into the classroom, that won't be right, because these two endeavors aren't for the same thing. And that's why I say no when people ask me to help them learn about how to do civil debate. Because debate is what we do when we want one person to win over the other, or one team to win over the other, or yes to win over no, or no to win over yes. But it is not how we find out together what options are in our shared interest and what truths can inform responsible, creative, and collaborative decision making. And that's what civic engagement is. Finally, the last big idea for the day is that our responsibilities include taking on and leveling the unequal playing field that often inheres when we are being as open-minded as we want to be to multiple options in the public interest. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So that's why this is not another lecture on free speech from a free speech lawyer lady, even though I actually happen to think that the system of keeping government out of decisions what's said is the best one. But for those of you who've seen, a very important movie, Jurassic Park, you know that a lot of the whole plot of this movie turns on that it was an incredibly bad idea to create carnivorous dinosaurs, and that there's no way to, do this responsibly. And so I have my operative gift for civic engagement is, it's our own responsibility to decide, what we're going to do. Your scientists were so preoccupied with asking if they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. So my model for civic engagement moves us from rights, I have the right to say this, darn it, which is a position and one that isn't often all that productive, to responsibilities. A speech rights lens, right? So not so preoccupied about whether we can speak. Presumably in an academic or civic community, we are open to hearing everything that we need to hear from everyone in the room about how to solve problems in our shared interest. But each of us hopefully holds a responsibility to bring something productive, positive, and worthwhile into that space. And in response to, in order to discover the win-win, as our colleague Stanley said, and in order as well to deal with the fact that some things that we can bring into these civic spaces can actually be harmful. So a speech rights lens says, there's a rebuttable, almost irrebuttable presumption of your right to speak. So no one can stop me. It centers the speaker. I really want to say this thing that I want to say, and not very oriented toward the audience, and considers only whether speech is permissible and protected, not whether it's productive. Now, speech responsibilities lens, a few of you in the chat mentioned the importance of listening to civic dialogue. This doesn't surprise me in a campus space, in a college space, where listening is so much of what we do. When we look at speech, and particularly civic engagement, through a responsibilities lens, we have a rebuttable presumption that concerns about speech are made in good faith. So when I talk about a rebuttable presumption, what I mean is you might be familiar with the presumption of innocence, right? Where when the state wants to convict us of a crime, we are presumed innocent, and it is the burden of the state to show otherwise. I would give a rebuttable presumption that speakers are speaking in good faith, and that the people who say that we've offended, harmed, hurt, are also making that criticism in good faith and receive it with gratitude. A speech responsibilities lens centers the listener. So some of you mentioned in the chat, listening to understand. I would argue that the responsibility to communicate to be understood, not to win, not to shame, not to produce an in-crowd and an out-crowd, not to perform, but to be understood by your listener is a good kind of civic speech. And finally, focuses on whether speech is effectively communicating. So instead of looking at whether I have crossed a very rare line after which government might be able to censor or punish me, which is rare circumstances, including threats and harassment, instead focusing on the way that we as speakers use that freedom in order to do something that's better than the alternative. The second part of my framework for civic engagement is a second paradigm shift. So from speech rights to responsibilities, and a paradigm shift from debate to inquiry. I'm currently writing a book, working title of which is Try to Love the Questions, From Debate to Inquiry in Campus Speech. And the name comes from Letters to a Young Poet by a poet named Rilke. Trying to love questions rather than trying to love winning, I would say, is inherent in the academic mission and inherent in the mission of civic engagement. We engage with one another because we want to seek greater truths in our best interest, and we want to find winning options in our shared interest. So a debate lens says that I'm coming into some civic space with a binary options, red or blue, yes or no. Our discussion is a performance, right? I'm debating you not so that we all become wiser or better off, but so an audience thinks that I'm better than you or more ready for the job or tougher than you. It's zero sum, and it cultivates distrust in the other speaker. And if you think about the political debates we watch, oftentimes they're supposed to be performances that make you come away mistrusting whoever is supposed to be the loser. In our currently very polarized and partisan times, these debates very seldom move people anyway. They tend to deepen our antipathies. An inquiry lens has infinite options. A rebuttable presumption that other voices are similarly trying to pursue the best interest. And the discussion is informative. Everyone can benefit. Everyone can be trustworthy. So for those of us who are involved in teaching, and I do, a lot of workshops on how to increase engagement and have great conversations in classrooms, or those of us who are involved in learning, or those of us simply who are going to the next, city council or school board meeting, really wanting to do good in this world. One of the things that I really encourage is to change the way we think about questions. And I, again, try to love the questions. It helps to ask great questions. So a debate question is usually a yes-no question. For the purposes of our gathering about sustainability, should college ban commuting in cars? It's a yes-no question. Typically, people who have one position will come in and have their side that they want, and there aren't there aren't multiple options that can be made. But a question that is more about an inquiry mindset and not a debate mindset is, under what circumstances can our institution limit carbon emissions or incentivize sustainable alternatives? This is the kind of question that people working together can actually, hopefully, identify other questions. My favorite question is, what would I need to know? Right? What would I need to know about the campus? What would I need to know about the rules that govern the campus? What would I need to know about the sources of carbon emissions on the campus? Are they more individuals? Are they more institutional? There are so many things that we would have to ask before even starting to come up with options in our shared interest that are so much different than debate. And I think this is really important in college. And those of us in my audience, and I apologize, I can't see you in this format, who are students, I'm not saying this to diminish the wisdom and expertise that students can bring into a classroom. But the reality is, we're generally in college if we're a student because we're at the beginning of that learning process, or we're in the middle of that learning process, involved in that learning process. And so stepping into a classroom already ready to debate and defend a previously held position isn't really doing college. Those of us in the room who are teachers, I would really encourage teaching prompts and conversation prompts and questions, whether it's for assessments or for class discussion, that foreground the types of things that allow students to generate different options and different additional questions. Under what circumstances is generally a richer question than yes, no. And of course, when we ask yes, no questions, we're always going to ask the line drawing question afterward anyway. Well, where would you draw the line? What about my hypothetical? Teaching students to consider challenging questions, be they about our environment or about public health or about any other thing that matters that people in communities decide together, as under what circumstances questions rather than yes, no questions, can not only offer them, put the ball in their court to come up with new and creative ways of thinking, but also break them away from purely partisan, tribal, or binary type thinking that infuses the kind of dialogue that we often see in the political spaces outside of classrooms and outside of the kinds of civic spaces that we want to be creating for activism or civic engagement on sustainability. So this is my framework for dialogue. One is to understand the rules and norms that apply to each circumstance. Now, my specialty usually is speech on campus. And in college campuses, there are rules and norms. The rules tend to be much freer than in K to 12, where we can be told, you know, don't wear that sweatshirt, don't wear that short skirt, don't wear that tank top, don't show that political slogan. But these are actually narrower norms of speech than out in the world. Out in the world, an unsupported conspiracy theorist YouTube video is fair game for political conversation. It is not in an academic space. So understanding the norms, for example, of the types of evidence that we utilize in our disciplines. This is a great thing to try to bring over into civic dialogue. The idea that there are rules of truthfulness, credibility that can come into political discussions too. Engaging in self-reflection. Each of us should know what kind of speaker and listener we are. There was a recent Knight Foundation survey of campus speech that asks students about their sense of freedom on campus to share their opinions, and I can send the link along to the Summit staff after this. And one of the things that really struck me, but then didn't surprise me, is that students overwhelmingly rated themselves much more open-minded than they rated their peers, which means that people were perceiving others to be closed-minded and perceiving themselves to be in communities where maybe opposing ideas weren't necessarily desired, but didn't think that was how they were at all, right? So engaging in that self-reflection, what is it about me as a listener or a speaker or a member of this community that might make me a part of everybody else's impression that we're not that open-minded? And so I encourage students, I have a document called Building My Voice on the Project on Civil Discourse website that's just a self-reflection about how open we are to listening, what kind of listener we are, what kind of communicator we are. And I encourage people to work with students and community groups and each other about that openness. How open am I to civic dialogue? And when I do workshops for teachers, one of the things that I include is self-reflections about how much have I done to make my classroom a space where it's been very explicitly said and kind of put into practice that ideas and inquiry can thrive here, and respect. Listen and read with a mindset of informed generosity. I like to use, I've heard people use the term charity, but I think charity kind of doesn't sit as well with me. But being generous to those around us and saying, I am going to believe in your good faith. I'm going to believe that when you make a mistake, it's a mistake. I'm going to assume until you show me otherwise that you've come into this room with the same will to do right in our shared interests, whether it's as an academic community or as a world community or a local community as I have. Now I say informed generosity, right, because we don't all have to be Charlie Brown with Lucy pulling the football away. There are trolls, and there are people who will come into our spaces, be they classrooms or civic dialogues, not ready to earn that generosity and communicate in good faith. But we should not assume everyone's a troll and an enemy at the outset. And I would say this is an important lesson to give students and ourselves about texts too. So a thing that I like to do is assign a piece by Abraham Lincoln, his Lyceum speech, and a piece by Ibram Kendi, his More Devoted to Order Than Justice, two figures for whom somebody in the room probably everybody in the room is going to find fault with at least one of them, if not both of them in some way, and say, what do you want to do about these imperfect human beings who have shared some ideas with you? How do you want to approach these two texts? And of course, both texts are in fact about the limits and nature of civic dialogue. So it's what we might call meta. Learn to love questions and seek answers. So getting comfortable not being an expert. It's very hard. I don't know if you can see it. I am wearing my little IDK pin, which stands for I don't know. Internet speak for I don't know. We give these out at the Project on Civil Discourse. Being comfortable saying I don't know in front of one another is a mindset of inquiry. It's a condition precedent to listening to one another and working in our shared interests. And finally, communicating to be understood. So not to dominate, shame, belittle, or win, but truly to make oneself understood. Important skills for these kinds of conversations: accord or rebuttable presumption of good faith, as I mentioned. Practice active listening and show your attention. And I really encourage people to do listening exercises for themselves and with their students. I found that when I started having students do a 3-minute listening exercise, so one student gets to talk for 3 minutes uninterrupted, and then they do a little bit of sort of clarifying discussion, and then they switch sides. I found that overwhelmingly my students did not have a lot of experience listening to someone continuously for 3 minutes. So practicing that active listening. One of the things that's interesting when I do these exercises, I do a little sort of post-game analysis, and I ask people, how many of you heard something in the beginning of the 3 minutes that you ordinarily would have interrupted with a question or a concern, but somewhere later in the 3 minutes, the person actually addressed that question or concern? And almost everybody says yes. And it can be a remarkable, remarkable exercise for getting people accustomed to the idea that if you're not sitting on the edge of your seat waiting to rebut or jump in, you will find that your fellow discussant is actually going to address your concerns and that it's worth the investment in listening in good faith. Reflect on what you've heard, which can be a great way of making sure that you and your speaker have a shared understanding. Reflect on your own reactions. Always find out, what makes me defensive? What kind of ideas do I find it hard to sit through? Engage with others' ideas. Accept informed criticism of your own ideas. And recognize the legitimacy of other views. Now that all sounds really great, but you might be like, oh, hey, genius, everybody knows this, but have you noticed out there, it's awful. We're yelling at each other. We hate each other. By the way, some people are actually hateful. You've just described a morning in Disneyland. You haven't described a morning in America. And what I'd say is that many things can be true at once. There are trolls, but I don't think we have evidence that the preponderance of Americans are truly hateful or hate each other. A lot of the time in our classroom circumstances in particular, and we're a little bit lucky because people take a college class with an understanding that they're hopefully going to learn something, hopefully going to have a shared goal. And that's not necessarily the case when people log on to online. Many people can believe they're acting in good faith, but still bring in misinformation. They can be committed to being fair, but either make their process inaccessible, or they can think that they're being a good community member to people who are different to them or not the default identity in the room, but mess up. And I think one of the most common ways is misusing the term we to be usually a default majority view. So I heard people say, well, we really didn't know how much racism there was in America until this one particular election, and that we was an implied small subset of the population. Some people don't engage in good faith, and not all information is equal or even is information. So what do? So first, we have to be explicit and show humility. We do have to talk to the people in our communities about some standards that we might be applying to discourse. In school, that can be academic standards. So we accept a narrower array of evidence than what is on YouTube. There are standards that are neutral, that don't relate in any way to partisanship or our external civic battles, that apply to how we deploy information in college spaces. And that would be a good model for civic spaces as well. We also have to recognize that although the law treats all viewpoints similarly, our disciplines in our community might not. So it's true that the government can't punish the KKK for existing and marching, that the government cannot stop neo-Nazis from existing and marching. But we, the people, thinking from a realm of speech responsibilities and not rights, can insist on a higher level of something much better in the way that we treat each other, particularly in classrooms and campuses, and particularly by letting all of our community members know what kinds of transgressions, harm others. We can utilize standards of truth and intellectual inquiry. I really do believe that the answer to a lot of what's challenging could be you know, in our civic life could be remedied if we just let the librarians be in charge of everything. I do believe that that it has now become a civic responsibility to teach and practice information literacy and teach the people around us how to curate information for quality and credibility. We need to stop centering defensive reactions. Some of the things that we might say out of truth and concern for our communities will make some people angry, but I don't know that we necessarily want to give all of the space to the people who feel hurt, for example, by our saying that carbon use is killing the planet or that racism is killing our neighbors. We can model gratitude for learning opportunities. I say this as a teacher. I think if we want students and want people in our communities to, oh, and I see the 3 p.m. session is on media literacy, wonderful. I'd say we can model gratitude when we're corrected. And that includes even as a teacher, if you, whatever it might be, you get mispronounce someone's name, you misgender someone, you get something wrong and someone corrects you, model saying thank you. When we get used to the idea that having people ask more of us, be kinder, be more culturally competent, be more sustainable, be more aware of the impact of our words on other people. When we start realizing that this is our communities helping us to do better and not limiting our freedom, I think we'll find civic engagement enormously rewarding. What if things go wrong? People get stuff wrong, and I'm not a person who necessarily believes the moral panic over something called cancel culture. I think we have abundant evidence that many of us are trying to be as generous with one another as we can. That being said, one of the things that I think is a real positive about where we're moving in a society when we think about something like, for example, incarceration and criminality, is that people are starting to realize maybe locking lots and lots of people up wasn't the best idea. It was, by the way, a bipartisan idea. And I will say that there are lots of really bad bipartisan ideas and really great ideas that neither of our major parties yet adopt. So we need some other model rather than partisanship to think about how we're going to change the world. When people get something wrong, and they will because they're people, I would say have that same restorative mindset towards sort of discursive community transgression that more and more of us are hoping to have toward, for example, criminality. Think about restoration, relationship building, and what we can continue to do in our shared interest. Not exile, right? There is a lot of daylight between getting rid of someone out of your life and accepting the status quo. And it's in finding that daylight between those two things that we're really engaging in civic dialogue. Come equipped with solutions and not only observations about problems. So if you're going to be a student activist or an environmental activist, come to the table not with just a no, but with what you want to see in the world. And if you're on the institutional end, if you're a professor, if you're a dean, if you're a provost, if you're a city council member, and you're hearing people bringing only problems and not solutions, then there's a good chance that you need to look at whether you've really built the mechanisms for people to engage with you and the mechanisms for people to offer solutions, and then invest in them. So my closing thought for you is that you personally are a precious and limited resource. Use that freedom that you have sustainably, be good to yourselves, engage in the kinds of dialogues that can be better than the alternative, maybe take a time out from the kinds of dialogues that are not in our public interest, that are merely performative debate and hurting. Take time to reflect deeply. And I'm really grateful for any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Lara. That was fabulous. I love it. While I'm giving people an opportunity to, here is a question, our first question. How should we think about the situation when we find ourselves concluding that the other discussant is not engaging in good faith? Is the conversation salvageable?
So I think if you really believe that the person isn't discussing in good faith, it might not be salvageable. Depending upon your relationship to the person, if this is just online, if it seems like someone's not engaging in good faith, you might be right. I actually think this is a time for questions. So if this is a colleague, a community member, someone that you really have an investment in hoping to have this conversation with, asking a question along the lines, I need to know if there's a chance that we can learn from one another here and potentially find some common ground, because I want to do that, but I'm getting for the sense from you that maybe you don't want to be engaging with me with my idea right now. Do I have that right? It can be surprising, and I think this is more true online and in spaces like this one. It can be surprising that our impressions of how we're communicating and the impressions that people are getting of us are misaligned. So I always ask, and I do this, I'm a trained mediator too, so I ask this of third parties too. I ask, like, can I take the temperature of the room here? Are we on a fool's errand, or can we be learning something? And it's helpful to stick to the golden rule of sticking to I statements here. So don't characterize the other person as like, as I'm listening to you here, I'm wondering if this is something you want to be doing. I'm wondering if we can be in dialogue about this, or if we're too far apart. Like, is there any hope here? As opposed to saying, you're being awful and closed-minded. And find out. And sometimes the act of asking could actually open the door a little bit. But sometimes we have a civil discourse project discussion that our students lead called I've Heard Enough. And it's about figuring out when your open-mindedness ends and when, going about your life and being more productive on something else ends. And that's both a question in these dialogues, but also in research, right? When have I read enough articles and can I start writing?
Thank you. So we have one more question, and then I have a question for you also, and I think that'll be probably about it. But the question that I want you to answer last is, tell us a little bit more about your book and how people who are interested in communicating with you or giving you feedback on that can get in touch with you. That's the last question. And then the question I'm going to ask you to answer right now is, in your opinion, is part of the communication problems about our politics the facts that conversations focus on just 2 points of view, right and left? And if so, does this prevent us from finding a middle ground?
Love that question. I do think that's a big part of our problem. We are polarized. We are hyper-polarized. More Americans live in what's defined as a hyper-polarized county than at any time since they've been checking, meaning a place that one candidate or the other won by more than 20 points. So we're less likely to come into conversation with people with a different partisanship. But the thing about our partisanship in America is it's not actually necessarily ideological. It's actually like teams. So as a Red Sox fan, right, I embrace your loss of the, of the Astros loss. There's not a difference in ideology between Red Sox and Astros and Rangers and Braves fans. There's a difference in team membership. And it is true that there is a difference between the parties in the policies that they support. Although that's a little bit plastic, right? Before the 2016 election, free trade, no tariffs was a Republican perspective, right? So some of these things slip. And before the last couple of years, vaccines weren't a partisan issue. In fact, in some of the places where they were a little bit, there were actually more left people who were, Park Slope, Brooklyn, parts of Portland, not using them. So So partisanship isn't a great proxy for ideology, and we don't tend to embrace partisanship based on the ideas that we like. It's team membership purely. So it's not a great way. It's a good way to have a conversation about who to vote for, but it's not a great way to have a governance conversation, and it's really not a great way to have a conversation about problem solving. One thing I like about local government as an exercise for students is that oftentimes the things that we care about locally they transcend some of the big partisan differences. So whether you build a new school or something. But yeah, I would say that partisan affiliation is not a good starting point for dialogue. And if you're trying to make your school or your classroom a place where there's dialogue across difference, going, I'm going to put some red people and blue people together and have a party, or I'm going to have a red person and a blue person give a lecture and be nice to each other, I'll say that that's not moving things forward, because that's not what academic inquiry is about. And I'd say it definitely doesn't move things forward in giving participants the feeling of really taking the problem solving into their own hands. So that's my answer to your second to last question. Should I go into the other stuff?
Yeah, just quickly tell people how they can get in touch with you about your book if they want to give you feedback.
So I just gave my AU email address in the chat, and people can definitely email me there. It's lschwart@american.edu, so no Z. I am in the process of writing a text that will be a student-facing text that I hope could be assigned in intro communication classes, intro government classes, as a common read for incoming first-year students, as a book for first-year seminars, and it engages with this idea of moving from debate to inquiry in academic dialogue, and gives students the sort of why of adopting a framework for approaching your college and civic work and discourse with a mindset of informed generosity and inquiry. So it's something that I am writing it now. I would welcome people's thoughts on what they'd like to see in it. There will be a piece in it teaching about campus speech and academic freedom and the sort of rules and lawyerly part, but a lot of it is about how we listen and learn, a lot like what I shared today. And it will be published in 2023.
Thank you so much. We have one more excellent question, and if we can answer it in 1 minute or less, that would be great. And then again, thank you so much for joining us today. So the last question: if there is an audience, do we have a responsibility to push back on more minor things like misinformation that one would normally let slide for the sake of continuing the conversation?
I actually think that there is an obligation to push back on misinformation. We can do it kindly. We can do it wisely in service of shared relationships. I don't recommend shaming people. Nobody likes being shamed. Think about your cat. That's how much, when you catch them out. Nobody likes being shamed. There's a wonderful tool called the Debunking Handbook that you can find in PDF form online that helps with good, productive responses to misinformation. And the New York Times also did, if your particular misinformation is public health misinformation, the New York Times did this great chatbot article that gives you a little proposed language for dealing with vaccine-related both hesitancy and disinformation. So I would say yes, take it on, but remember that you're taking on disinformation and not people. If someone's trolling, cutting them out might be wise, and I'm a fan of blocking people on social media if they're using your platform as a place to misinform others in a way that ultimately does harm.
Thank you for joining us. You guys, the next session starts at 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock. It's Can Mindfulness and Compassion Training Increase Responsiveness and Resilience to the Climate Crisis? So I hope you can join us. Thank you again, and we hope to have you back very soon.